Check his briefcase. The little girl's voice sliced through the silence so suddenly that every conversation inside the glass-walled boardroom stopped at once. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while nearly 100 executives, investors, attorneys, and guests turned toward the same tiny figure standing beside the open conference doors. 9-year-old Amara Johnson was barely tall enough to see over the long walnut table, yet something in her steady brown eyes made the room feel strangely smaller. Nathaniel Whitmore, the billionaire founder of Whitmore Biotech, froze with one hand resting on a stack of merger documents. For a heartbeat, even the humming air conditioning seemed to disappear. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. At the opposite end of the room, Victor Hale adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and offered the kind of polite smile that usually settled every disagreement before it began. "Sir," Amara said again, her voice quieter now, but somehow even harder to ignore. "Please, check his briefcase before he leaves." A ripple of uneasy whispers drifted across the room. Several board members exchanged confused glances while security instinctively stepped toward the child. Nathaniel slowly looked from Amara to Victor, then back again. He recognized the girl. She had spent the morning in the company lobby waiting for her aunt, one of the building's maintenance supervisors. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the executive floor. Yet there she stood, clutching a small bracelet made of worn blue beads that clicked softly against her wrist as her fingers trembled. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shouting anymore. She simply watched Victor with remarkable certainty. Victor gave a gentle chuckle that sounded almost rehearsed. "Children have incredible imaginations," he said warmly. Someone must have wandered into the wrong hallway. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. One investor quietly nodded as though the explanation made perfect sense. Nathaniel remained silent. Something felt different. It wasn't Amara's words alone. It was the way Victor had tightened his grip around the leather handle of the black briefcase resting beside his polished shoes. Only for an instant. Only long enough for someone paying close attention to notice. Nathaniel had built billion-dollar companies by noticing moments exactly like that. "Young lady," one security officer said kindly, "let's help you find your family." Amara slowly shook her head. "I'm not lost." Her answer floated through the room with surprising calm. "But something important is." The words landed heavier than anyone expected. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Outside the towering windows, afternoon sunlight reflected across the Chicago skyline, casting long bands of gold across the conference table. Everything looked beautiful, organized, successful. Yet beneath that polished surface, an uncomfortable tension quietly spread from chair to chair like invisible static. Victor laughed again, this time just a little louder. "Mr. Whitmore, if we delay the shareholder vote because of a misunderstanding, we'll lose valuable time." Nathaniel still didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at Amara. "Why his briefcase?" he asked. Several executives sighed with relief, expecting an innocent misunderstanding. Amara swallowed once before answering. "Because that's not the same one he carried this morning." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Victor's smile remained in place, but only barely. "What makes you think that?" Nathaniel asked. Amara glanced toward the elevator doors behind Victor. "I was waiting downstairs for my aunt." He came in carrying another briefcase. Brown leather. It had a silver scratch near the lock. Then he went into the executive elevator with another man. A few minutes later, he came back alone carrying this black one. Several heads slowly turned toward Victor's briefcase. It looked expensive. Ordinary. Perfectly clean. Victor folded his arms. "Mr. Whitmore, children confuse details all the time." Amara gently touched one of the blue beads on her bracelet. "No, sir," she whispered. "I remember details because my grandma always told me that little things tell the biggest truths." Nathaniel studied her expression. There was no anger, no panic, only quiet conviction. He had spent decades negotiating with politicians, scientists, competitors, and billionaires around the world. He knew what fear looked like. He knew what deception looked like. And somehow this child standing alone before an entire boardroom displayed neither. One director leaned toward Nathaniel and spoke softly. "Perhaps we should continue the meeting." Another nodded in agreement. "The acquisition deadline is only 30 minutes away." Nathaniel remained motionless. His attention stayed fixed on Victor, whose fingers had once again settled protectively around the briefcase handle. Just for a second. Just enough. The billionaire's heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. Years of experience had taught him that truth rarely announced itself loudly. More often, it arrived disguised as an interruption everyone wished would disappear. Amara looked down briefly before raising her eyes once more. "I know I wasn't supposed to come in here," she said gently. "I'm sorry about that. But if he walks out with that briefcase, someone who didn't do anything wrong is going to get blamed." Her words echoed softly against the high ceiling. Across the table, Nathaniel noticed several executives suddenly avoiding eye contact. Somewhere in the back of the room, a glass of water was carefully placed onto the table with a tiny click that sounded impossibly loud. Victor straightened his jacket and offered another composed smile. "Mr. Whitmore," he said smoothly, "shall we proceed?" Nathaniel never answered. Instead, his eyes slowly drifted downward until they rested on the black leather briefcase beside Victor's chair, and for the very first time that afternoon, the billionaire found himself wondering whether the smallest voice in the building had just uncovered the largest secret in the company. Nathaniel Whitmore did not reach for the briefcase. Instead, he slowly looked around the boardroom, studying every face before allowing the silence to settle naturally. The executives who had confidently discussed billion-dollar strategies only moments earlier now shifted uneasily in their chairs. Victor Hale remained perfectly composed, his polished shoes planted squarely on the marble floor, his pleasant smile never quite fading. "Mr. Whitmore," Victor said in an even tone, "our shareholders have flown in from across the country. They deserve our attention, not an interruption that is clearly based on a misunderstanding." Several directors nodded almost automatically. One elderly board member leaned forward and quietly added, "Perhaps we should allow security to escort the young lady back downstairs. We can investigate whatever concerns she has after the meeting." Nathaniel still said nothing. His eyes drifted toward Amara. The little girl stood exactly where she had been moments before, both hands wrapped around the blue beaded bracelet on her wrist. She looked nervous, but she never looked away. Nathaniel had met countless people who became louder when challenged. Amara had done the opposite. Every sentence she spoke became calmer than the last. Somehow that made her words feel heavier. One security officer approached her carefully with a reassuring smile. "Miss, we are not upset with you. We just need to take you back to the lobby. Your aunt is probably worried." Amara politely shook her head. "She knows I came upstairs." The officer paused. "Then let us handle everything from here." Amara looked at Nathaniel instead of the officer. "If you wait until later, it will be too late." Those simple words echoed through the room. Victor folded his hands comfortably. "Children often believe every moment is urgent," he said with a soft laugh. "I am sure she means well." Nathaniel finally spoke. "Amara." She immediately answered. "Yes, sir. Have you ever met Mr. Hale before today?" "No, sir." "Did anyone ask you to come into this meeting?" "No, sir." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Then why are you here?" She took a careful breath before answering. "Because I heard something that did not sound right." Victor raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. Nathaniel continued. "Tell me exactly what you heard." Amara looked briefly toward the windows as if replaying the memory inside her mind. "I was sitting near the employee lounge while my aunt finished cleaning one of the conference rooms. Two men walked past me. One of them was Mr. Hale. They did not notice me, because I was reading my library book." Victor gave a patient smile. Children do enjoy listening to conversations they are not supposed to hear. Amara ignored the remark. One man asked if everything was inside the case. Mr. Hale answered that nobody would ever think to look there because everyone trusted him. Several people exchanged uncertain glances. Victor lightly cleared his throat. That could refer to any business document. Nathaniel looked directly at him. "Did you have that conversation?" Victor answered without hesitation. "I speak with dozens of people every day. I cannot possibly remember every sentence." Nathaniel accepted the answer without showing emotion. Then he turned back to Amara. "What happened next?" The other man asked if someone might notice the switch. Mr. Hale smiled and said that people only notice what they expect to see. A faint murmur spread across the room. Victor slowly exhaled through his nose before speaking again. "Mr. Whitmore, fragments of conversations can easily be misunderstood. We negotiate confidential agreements every week. Surely everyone here understands that." Another director quickly agreed. "That sounds perfectly reasonable." Nathaniel rested both hands on the conference table. Perhaps it does. The room relaxed slightly. Victor's shoulders loosened almost invisibly. Then Nathaniel added, "But I have learned that reasonable explanations and truthful explanations are not always the same thing." Once again the room fell quiet. Outside, a passing cloud softened the afternoon sunlight, leaving the boardroom wrapped in a cooler shade. The reflection on the polished table faded just enough for Nathaniel to notice something he had overlooked earlier. Victor's black leather briefcase appeared brand new, yet one corner carried a faint line of fresh dust, almost as if it had recently been placed on a concrete surface. It was a tiny detail. Most people would never have noticed it. Nathaniel quietly asked, "Victor, where have you been since arriving this morning?" "My office. The legal department. This meeting. Anywhere else?" Victor smiled politely. "No." Before Nathaniel could respond, Amara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is not true." I returned to the little girl. She looked almost embarrassed to interrupt, yet she continued anyway. When he came back from the executive elevator, he stopped near the visitor lockers for just a minute. I remember because he almost dropped his coffee. Victor turned toward her for the first time since the meeting began. His expression remained courteous, but his eyes hardened ever so slightly before softening again. "You certainly have an impressive memory," Amara answered quietly. "My grandma says that when people are kind, you remember their faces. When something feels wrong, you remember everything." Nathaniel slowly straightened his posture. The board members waited for him to dismiss the child and continue the meeting. Instead, he reached toward the intercom built into the conference table. His finger rested lightly above the button while every person in the room held their breath, uncertain whether the next words would restart the meeting or begin something that none of them had expected when the morning first began. The room remained perfectly still as Nathaniel Whitmore pressed the intercom button only halfway before lifting his finger again. He was not ready to summon anyone. Not yet. His instincts had carried him through decades of impossible negotiations, and those same instincts were telling him that rushing the next decision would only make the truth harder to see. He looked toward Victor Hale once more. "Before this meeting continues," Nathaniel said calmly, "I want to clear up one small question." Victor gave a respectful nod. "Of course. Would you place your briefcase on the table?" The request sounded ordinary, almost harmless. Several directors relaxed, expecting the moment to end within seconds. Victor smiled politely and reached down for the black leather briefcase. He lifted it with one hand and carefully placed it beside the stack of merger documents. The soft sound of leather touching polished wood echoed through the silent boardroom. Nathaniel did not ask for it to be opened. Instead, he walked around the table, stopping only a few feet away. "How long have you owned this briefcase?" Victor answered without hesitation. "About 6 months." Nathaniel slowly circled the table. "It still looks brand new." Victor smiled again. "I take care of my belongings." Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully before turning toward Amara. "You mentioned another briefcase this morning. What made you so certain they were different?" Every executive watched the little girl. She took one careful breath before answering. "The first one was brown. The leather looked older. It had a silver scratch near the lock that caught the light when the elevator doors opened." Nathaniel glanced at the black case resting on the table. "And this one? This one never had that scratch." Victor folded his hands together. "Mr. Whitmore, with respect, memory is not evidence." Nathaniel answered quietly. "Sometimes memory leads us to evidence." He turned toward the conference room windows where sunlight reflected across the neighboring skyscrapers. The city looked peaceful from 72 floors above the streets, but inside the boardroom every heartbeat seemed louder than before. One board member finally spoke. "Nathaniel, perhaps we should simply open the case and settle this." Another immediately disagreed. "Those files may contain confidential legal material." A third director added, "We have policies protecting attorney-client privilege." Nathaniel listened without interrupting. Then he looked directly at Victor. "Do you object to opening it?" Victor maintained perfect composure. "I object only because it creates an unfortunate precedent. If every accusation results in personal searches, trust inside this company disappears." Several executives quietly agreed. It was a convincing argument. Nathaniel almost smiled. Victor always knew exactly which words sounded reasonable. Before anyone could speak again, Amara gently raised her hand. The simple gesture felt strangely out of place inside a room filled with powerful adults. Nathaniel acknowledged her with a small nod. Yes, Amara? She looked embarrassed for interrupting. May I ask Mr. Hale one question? Victor spread his hands graciously. Certainly. Amara looked directly at him. If there is nothing important inside your briefcase, why did you keep holding the handle every time someone mentioned it? The question landed with unexpected weight. Victor blinked once. Only once. It lasted less than a second, yet Nathaniel noticed it immediately. Victor recovered with another pleasant smile. Habit, he answered. Everyone has little habits. Amara slowly nodded. My grandma says habits tell you what people protect without realizing it. No one laughed. Nathaniel looked down at the briefcase again. Suddenly another detail returned to his memory. Earlier that morning his daughter, Grace Whitmore, had called him sounding unusually discouraged. Confidential research files had disappeared overnight, and although no accusation had been made publicly, whispers inside the legal department had already begun suggesting that someone close to the executive offices had mishandled sensitive information. Grace had insisted she had never touched the missing files. Nathaniel believed her, but belief without proof meant very little inside a corporation worth billions of dollars. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. After a few quick taps, he opened an internal security application connected to the building access system. Every executive badge recorded movement between restricted floors. Nathaniel studied the screen without speaking. His expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened. Victor, he said quietly, you told me you traveled only between your office, the legal department, and this meeting. That is correct. Nathaniel turned the phone so the nearest directors could see the display. Then perhaps you can explain why your security badge accessed the visitor locker area at 10:17 this morning. A ripple of astonishment spread around the room. Victor looked at the screen before answering. I must have taken a wrong hallway. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. A wrong hallway that requires executive clearance. Victor remained silent for the first time that afternoon. The silence itself seemed louder than any explanation. Amara looked toward the floor instead of celebrating. She simply tightened her fingers around the blue beads on her bracelet. Nathaniel noticed her quiet humility. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She only wanted the truth to reach the surface. Nathaniel slowly placed his phone back into his pocket and rested one hand beside the briefcase. His voice remained calm enough to make every word unmistakably clear. We are no longer deciding whether to continue a meeting. We are deciding whether the trust that built this company deserves to be protected. As those words settled across the boardroom, every eye returned to the black leather briefcase waiting silently on the polished table, and for the first time Victor Hale's confident smile disappeared completely. Nathaniel Whitmore let the silence remain exactly where it was. No one reached for a chair. No one whispered another opinion. The confidence that had filled the boardroom earlier that afternoon had quietly disappeared, replaced by a cautious uncertainty that even the city's magnificent skyline could not brighten. Victor Hale straightened the sleeve of his jacket before speaking again, his voice smooth and measured. Nathaniel, I understand why you have questions. If my security badge recorded a stop near the visitor lockers, then perhaps I was distracted. We all have demanding schedules. That does not make me dishonest. Nathaniel folded his hands in front of him. No, it does not. Victor nodded as though the conversation had finally begun returning to common sense. Then I believe we should continue with the meeting and allow our security department to review everything afterward. We have procedures for situations exactly like this. Several directors quietly agreed. Their expressions reflected relief more than confidence. Procedures felt comfortable. Procedures delayed difficult decisions. Nathaniel slowly turned toward the board members. Our procedures exist to protect the truth, not postpone it. The words settled heavily across the polished room. Victor answered immediately. And the truth also requires fairness. I have served this company for 12 years. During that time, I have negotiated acquisitions worth billions of dollars, defended this organization in court, and protected confidential research that helped save countless lives. Surely that record deserves more weight than assumptions built upon a child's observations. Nathaniel nodded once. Your record deserves respect. Victor allowed himself a small smile. Thank you. Nathaniel's expression never changed. But respect is not the same as exemption. The smile faded almost instantly. Nathaniel slowly walked toward the end of the conference table where the briefcase remained untouched. He rested one hand lightly against the polished wood without touching the case itself. Victor, I have trusted you with legal strategy, sensitive negotiations, and my family's reputation. That trust was earned over many years, which is precisely why I cannot ignore questions when they appear. Victor answered calmly. Then ask anything you wish. Nathaniel looked directly into his eyes. Did you switch briefcases this morning? Victor did not hesitate. No. Did you enter the visitor locker area? Briefly. Why? Victor paused for the first time before answering. I received a telephone call and wanted privacy. Nathaniel quietly considered the explanation. There are private offices on every executive floor. The hallway happened to be empty. Nathaniel nodded again. Did you meet anyone there? No. Did anyone hand you anything? No. Every answer arrived quickly, carefully, almost perfectly. Around the room, several directors began relaxing again. Victor sounded composed. His explanations sounded logical. Nathaniel understood exactly why so many people found them convincing. The most dangerous lies were rarely dramatic. They usually sounded ordinary. He turned toward Amara, who still stood quietly near the conference room doors. Amara, when you saw Mr. Hale near the lockers, was anyone else there? She thought carefully before answering. I only saw him. Victor spread his hand slightly. There you have it. Amara looked down at the blue beads around her wrist. But I heard another voice. Nathaniel immediately focused on her. You heard someone? She nodded. The lockers blocked my view. I only saw Mr. Hale when the other person walked away. Victor remained perfectly still. Nathaniel asked gently, what did the other voice say? Amara closed her eyes for just a moment, searching her memory with remarkable patience. He asked, are you sure nobody will notice? The boardroom grew quiet once more. Nathaniel waited. And what did Mr. Hale say? Amara answered in almost a whisper. People only look where they expect trouble. Nobody expects it from me. Victor slowly shook his head. That sentence could describe any confidential negotiation. Nathaniel accepted the possibility with a slight nod. Perhaps. Victor stepped half a pace forward, careful to keep his voice respectful. Nathaniel, if every ordinary conversation is turned into suspicion, this company cannot function. You hired me because I solved difficult problems quietly. That is exactly what I have done for years. Nathaniel studied him for several long seconds before asking one final question. Then you will have no objection if we quietly remove every doubt right now. Victor looked toward the briefcase for only the briefest instant before returning his attention to Nathaniel. I object to abandoning principle, not transparency. Nathaniel noticed the answer. Victor had spoken about principle. He had never actually agreed. Across the room, the afternoon sun slipped behind another cloud, leaving the glass walls covered in soft reflections that made every face appear almost ghost-like. Amara slowly lifted her eyes again. She was not watching Victor anymore. She was watching Nathaniel. There was no pressure in her expression, only hope that he would continue listening to what his own instincts had already begun telling him. Nathaniel understood that feeling well. Throughout his career, the greatest decisions had rarely depended upon the loudest voices. They depended upon the quiet details everyone else overlooked. He reached toward the briefcase at last, resting his fingertips gently on the handle without lifting it. The leather felt cool beneath his hand. Victor remained absolutely motionless. The board members leaned forward almost together. Even the security officers seemed to stop breathing. Nathaniel looked once more at Victor, then at Amara, and finally back at the silent black briefcase resting between them, realizing that whatever waited inside was no longer simply about missing documents. It had become a measure of trust itself, and everyone in the room understood that the next choice would change far more than the outcome of a single meeting. Nathaniel Whitmore closed his fingers around the handle but did not lift the briefcase. Instead, he slowly released it again and looked across the room with the calm expression that had unsettled competitors for more than 20 years. This discussion is no longer appropriate for a public board meeting, he said quietly. The shareholder vote will be postponed for 1 hour. A wave of surprise swept through the executives. One investor immediately began protesting that flights had been scheduled and contracts were waiting for signatures, but Nathaniel raised one hand gently. The room fell silent once more. Trust is the foundation of every agreement we sign, he continued. Without trust, There is no meeting worth finishing. He turned toward the head of corporate security. Please escort everyone to the executive lounge. Nobody is to leave this floor until I say otherwise. Although disappointed whispers spread through the room, no one argued further. Chairs slid backward. Papers were gathered. Conversations remained unusually quiet as directors and investors slowly filed toward the doors. Several glanced curiously at Amara before leaving, unable to understand how a little girl had completely changed the direction of a billion-dollar afternoon. Victor Hale remained standing beside the conference table. His expression had recovered its familiar confidence, but Nathaniel noticed that he no longer rested his hand on the briefcase. Instead, he stood with both hands comfortably folded in front of him. Nathaniel, Victor said with an understanding smile, I appreciate your desire to be thorough. I only hope we can resolve this quickly before unnecessary rumors begin spreading. Nathaniel answered with a polite nod. That is exactly what I intend to do. Within minutes, the enormous boardroom became almost empty. Only Nathaniel, Victor, Amara, two senior security officers, and Nathaniel's longtime executive assistant, Helen Brooks, remained. The silence felt completely different now. Without dozens of voices filling the room, every small sound became noticeable. The quiet hum of the climate system, the faint traffic far below, the ticking of an elegant wall clock imported from Switzerland years earlier. Nathaniel looked toward Amara. You have been very brave today. She lowered her eyes modestly. I was just trying to help. You understand that if you remembered something incorrectly, people could be hurt. She nodded immediately. I know, sir. That is why I waited until I was sure. Nathaniel studied her face carefully. There was no pride in her answer, only honesty. Helen stepped closer and offered Amara a bottle of water. You must be thirsty. Amara accepted it with both hands. Thank you, ma'am. Nathaniel noticed the simple courtesy. His grandmother had often told him that character revealed itself most clearly during stressful moments. The little girl had remained respectful from the instant she entered the room. Victor quietly cleared his throat. May I ask something? Nathaniel looked toward him. Go ahead. Victor turned to Amara with a gentle expression. You mentioned seeing me with a brown briefcase earlier this morning. Are you absolutely certain it was me? Many attorneys wear dark suits in this building. Amara thought carefully before replying. I remember your tie. Victor smiled politely. My tie. It has tiny silver squares. My grandma says patterns help you remember people. Victor glanced down briefly at his necktie before looking back at Nathaniel. That hardly proves anything. Nathaniel agreed. No, it does not. He walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The late afternoon light shimmered across the water, peaceful and almost motionless. For a long moment, he simply watched the horizon before speaking again. Do you know why I built this company? Nobody answered. Nathaniel continued softly. People think it was because I wanted success. They are wrong. I built it because my father believed promises mattered. He used to tell me that losing money could be recovered, but losing trust was far more expensive. He turned back toward the room. That lesson has guided every decision I have made. Victor nodded respectfully. It is one of the reasons I have admired working with you. Nathaniel smiled faintly. Then you understand why today cannot end with unanswered questions. He walked back to the conference table and looked at one of the security officers. Please bring me the visitor locker access records and the hallway camera log for 10 o'clock through 10:30 this morning. Yes, sir. The officer immediately left the room. Victor remained calm. I welcome any review. Nathaniel believed that sentence was carefully chosen. It sounded cooperative while revealing almost nothing. Helen quietly placed a tablet computer onto the table. The Information Technology Department has already confirmed that the missing research archive was last accessed at 10:21 this morning. Nathaniel looked at the timestamp without commenting. Amara's eyes suddenly widened. She looked toward the hallway outside the conference room. Sir. Nathaniel turned. What is it? She hesitated for only a second. The man who was with Mr. Hale. I remember something else. Every face in the room shifted toward her. She tightened her fingers around the blue beaded bracelet before continuing. He was carrying a visitor badge instead of an employee badge. It was hanging on a blue lanyard, and he kept turning it around so nobody could read the name. Nathaniel felt the pieces beginning to move into place. A visitor, a stop near the lockers, a missing archive, a switched briefcase. None of those details proved guilt by themselves, yet together they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. He looked calmly at Victor once again. The attorney's expression remained composed, but for the first time that afternoon Nathaniel noticed a tiny bead of perspiration near his temple. It lasted only a moment before disappearing, yet it was enough to convince him that the truth was no longer hiding very far away. The conference room door opened quietly as the head of corporate security returned carrying a tablet and a sealed envelope. He walked directly to Nathaniel Whitmore and handed both items over without saying a word. Nathaniel thanked him with a slight nod before opening the envelope. Inside was a printed visitor log from that morning. Every visitor entering the executive level had been required to sign in, present identification, and wear a temporary badge connected to the building security system. Nathaniel slowly scanned each name. Most belonged to financial consultants, technology vendors, and legal advisors who had attended scheduled appointments. Then one line caught his attention. The signature was nearly unreadable, but the sponsoring employee listed beside it was perfectly clear. Victor Hale. Nathaniel looked up without changing his expression. Victor, were you expecting a visitor this morning? Victor answered calmly. Yes, an outside compliance consultant. What was the consultant's name? Victor glanced briefly toward the visitor log before replying. Daniel Foster, if I remember correctly. Nathaniel lowered his eyes to the paper once more. Interesting. Helen Brooks quietly stepped beside him. Is something wrong? Nathaniel handed her the visitor log. Her eyes moved across the page before stopping at the same line. The visitor signed in as Daniel Foster, she said softly, but the identification number attached to the badge belongs to someone named Michael Turner. The room became still again. Victor offered an easy smile. Administrative mistakes happen every day. I would not read too much into that. Nathaniel did not argue. Instead, he activated the tablet and opened the hallway access records that had just been delivered. A digital floor map appeared on the screen, showing every executive badge movement between 10 o'clock and 10:30 that morning. Small blue dots marked each recorded entry. Victor's badge appeared first at the legal department, then outside the executive elevator, then near the visitor lockers at exactly 10:17, exactly as Nathaniel had already seen. A second badge appeared only seconds later. Visitor badge 27. The badge remained near the lockers for less than 1 minute before disappearing from the executive floor altogether. Nathaniel slowly zoomed in on the timeline. Helen, did visitor badge 27 ever sign out of the building? She searched another screen before answering. No, sir. According to the system, it was never returned. Victor folded his hands. Perhaps the visitor accidentally kept it. Nathaniel looked at him. Perhaps. The answer was quiet enough to reveal nothing. Amara stood silently beside the conference room doors, listening with careful attention. Suddenly, she frowned slightly as another memory surfaced. Sir. Nathaniel immediately turned toward her. Yes. She pointed gently toward the tablet. The visitor was wearing glasses. Victor remained perfectly still. Nathaniel asked, what kind of glasses? Round ones with gold frames. But when he walked away, he took them off and put them into his jacket pocket. Helen looked puzzled. Why would someone do that? Amara shrugged. I thought it was strange because he looked around first to make sure nobody was watching. Nathaniel slowly leaned back against the conference table. The details continued fitting together with unsettling precision. A visitor using mismatched identification. A missing badge. A brief stop beside the lockers. A switched briefcase. Missing research files. None of those facts alone answered every question, but together they formed a path that could finally be followed. The head of security cleared his throat. Sir, there is one more item. He opened another folder and produced a printed maintenance report. One hallway camera covering the visitor lockers stopped recording for 4 minutes this morning because of a temporary network interruption. Helen immediately looked at the timestamp. 10:16 until 10:20. Nathaniel slowly lifted his eyes. The interruption matched the exact window when Victor and the unidentified visitor had entered the area. Victor spoke before anyone else could. Technology fails. That hardly proves misconduct. Nathaniel agreed with a slight nod. No, it proves timing. The attorney's pleasant expression remained in place, but his confidence no longer carried the same quiet certainty it had earlier that afternoon. Nathaniel had negotiated enough complex agreements to recognize when someone had begun measuring every sentence instead of simply answering questions. He walked toward the conference room windows once again. Far below, the streets of downtown Chicago carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. Taxis moved through intersections. Pedestrians crossed sidewalks. Ferries glided across the river. Yet inside the executive floor of Whitmore Biotech, the future of the company now rested upon a handful of overlooked details and the courage of one observant little girl. Nathaniel turned back toward Amara. You have remembered more today than many trained investigators notice in an entire week. She smiled shyly. My grandma always says that when you pay attention because you care about people, you end up seeing things other people walk past. Nathaniel felt those words settle deeply in his mind. He looked once more at the unopened black briefcase resting quietly on the polished conference table. Every new discovery seemed to point back toward it, as though every unanswered question inside the building had somehow gathered in one ordinary object waiting for someone to finally look beyond its polished surface. The quiet inside the executive boardroom was interrupted by the soft vibration of Helen Brooks's tablet. She glanced at the notification, her expression tightening before she walked toward Nathaniel Whitmore. Sir, she said carefully, someone has just submitted an anonymous report to the corporate ethics office. Nathaniel accepted the tablet and silently read the message. It claimed that the missing research archive had been copied by Grace Whitmore earlier that morning and suggested that security should immediately investigate her office. Attached to the report was a photograph showing Grace carrying a document folder near the executive hallway. Several board members who had remained outside the room were beginning to receive the same notification on their phones. Within moments, whispers spread beyond the conference room walls. Victor Hale looked genuinely surprised. That is unfortunate, he said with a calm sigh. Rumors move much faster than facts. Nathaniel looked up from the screen without revealing what he was thinking. The timing is remarkable. Victor nodded, sympathetically. Unfortunately, people often assume the worst when confidential material disappears. Amara quietly stepped closer to Nathaniel. Sir, he looked down at her. Yes, Amara. That picture does not tell the whole story. Nathaniel handed her the tablet. What do you see? She studied the image for several seconds. Grace appeared to be walking past the executive hallway carrying a blue folder beneath her arm. At first glance, there seemed to be nothing unusual. Then Amara tilted the screen slightly toward the light coming through the windows. Look at the clock. Helen leaned closer. The decorative wall clock in the background showed 10:28. Nathaniel immediately frowned. The research archive was last accessed at 10:21. Helen nodded slowly. 7 minutes earlier. Amara continued. If Miss Grace already had the folder at 10:28, then this picture cannot prove she copied anything. She could have been carrying ordinary meeting papers. Nathaniel smiled faintly. Very good. Victor answered without hesitation. Exactly. Which is why nobody should jump to conclusions based on a single photograph. Nathaniel looked directly at him. An interesting observation. Victor seemed pleased that Nathaniel had agreed. The billionaire continued calmly. Then surely you would agree that nobody should dismiss concerns based on a single explanation either. Victor's smile faded once again. Before he could respond, the head of security entered carrying another tablet. Sir, our media relations office has detected anonymous messages appearing on several financial discussion boards. They claim that Grace Whitmore leaked company research and that an internal investigation has already confirmed her responsibility. Helen looked stunned. That is impossible. We have not released any information. Nathaniel accepted the tablet and quietly reviewed the posts. They had appeared only minutes earlier, each repeating nearly identical language. Whoever had written them wanted one story to spread before the truth had a chance to emerge. Nathaniel slowly lowered the tablet. Someone is attempting to shape public opinion before facts become available. Victor folded his arms thoughtfully. Perhaps whoever stole the files wishes to create confusion. Nathaniel answered with a calm nod. Perhaps. He walked toward the conference room windows again, watching clouds drift across the afternoon sky. His voice remained steady. My father once told me that lies are impatient. They always rush ahead because they know truth eventually catches them. The room fell silent as everyone considered those words. Amara looked at the blue beads around her wrist before speaking softly. My grandma used to say something similar. Nathaniel smiled gently. What did she say? She said that honest people wait because they know tomorrow will still belong to the truth. Helen's eyes softened. Even the security officers exchanged quiet glances. The simple wisdom spoken by the little girl somehow carried more weight than the expensive legal arguments filling the room all afternoon. Nathaniel turned toward the head of security. Lock every digital copy of the research archive. Freeze all external network transfers until further notice. I also want every security recording from this floor preserved, even if part of the footage appears incomplete. Yes, sir. The officer immediately left to carry out the instructions. Victor remained outwardly composed, but Nathaniel noticed another subtle change. The attorney had stopped offering explanations unless someone asked for them. He had become careful, extremely careful. That alone told Nathaniel the balance inside the room had begun to shift. Helen's tablet chimed once more. She looked at the new message before quietly handing it to Nathaniel. The Information Technology Department recovered one incomplete system log that was not erased during the network interruption. Nathaniel read the first few lines. The recovered record did not reveal the missing files, but it did confirm that an external storage device had briefly connected to a secure workstation at 10:19 that morning, only moments after Victor's security badge appeared near the visitor lockers. Nathaniel slowly looked toward the silent black briefcase resting on the polished conference table. Every new discovery continued pointing toward the same unanswered question, and every attempt to redirect suspicion only seemed to strengthen it. Across the room, Amara watched the briefcase quietly, her fingers resting on the blue bracelet her grandmother had given her years before. She did not celebrate. She did not accuse anyone. She simply waited with patient confidence, believing that sooner or later the truth hidden behind polished leather and careful words would finally have nowhere left to hide. The executive floor seemed suspended in time. Outside the towering windows, the late afternoon sun slowly dipped toward the Chicago skyline, painting long ribbons of amber across the polished conference table where the black briefcase still rested untouched. No one spoke for several seconds. Nathaniel Whitmore stood beside it with quiet patience, while Victor Hale remained only a few feet away, his posture still disciplined, his expression carefully controlled. Helen Brooks suddenly looked toward Amara with gentle curiosity. "You have remembered every important detail today," she said softly. "Is there anything else, no matter how small?" Amara lowered her eyes to the blue bracelet wrapped around her wrist. Her fingers slowly traced one smooth bead after another before she stopped. A faint look of surprise crossed her face. "I forgot something." Nathaniel immediately noticed the change in her expression. "Take your time." Amara nodded. "This bracelet was a birthday gift from my grandma." She smiled sadly. "She always worried whenever I waited alone after school, so my uncle helped her hide a tiny emergency recorder inside the clasp. She said if I ever felt frightened or confused, I could press the little bead and it would save everything I heard." Helen's eyes widened. "You activated it today?" Amara looked embarrassed. "I did not even remember until now. When those two men walked past me near the employee lounge, I pressed it because they sounded upset, and Grandma always told me that if something feels wrong, it is better to remember than to guess later." Nathaniel looked carefully at the bracelet. It appeared ordinary, just a simple string of blue beads surrounding a tiny silver clasp. "Does it still have the recording?" Amara nodded slowly. "I think so." Victor spoke for the first time in several minutes. "With respect, recordings made by consumer devices are often incomplete. Background noise can easily distort conversations." Nathaniel looked toward him without emotion. "That is true." Then he turned back to Amara. "May we listen anyway?" She gently unclasped the bracelet and handed it to Helen. Helen examined the tiny clasp before connecting it to her tablet using a small adapter from her desk organizer. The device recognized the storage almost instantly. A single audio file appeared on the screen with today's date and a timestamp beginning at 10:16 in the morning. Nobody moved. Helen looked at Nathaniel for permission. He simply nodded. She pressed play. At first, only ordinary hallway sounds filled the room. Footsteps, elevator chimes, distant conversations, the soft rolling of a cleaning cart. Then two voices became clearer. The first belonged to an unfamiliar man. "Are you sure nobody will notice?" A second voice answered almost immediately. Calm, confident, unmistakably Victor Hale. "People only look where they expect trouble." Nobody expects it from me. Every person in the conference room remained perfectly still. The recording continued. The unknown visitor spoke again. Once the files are inside, Grace Whitmore will take the blame. A long pause followed before Victor answered quietly. That is why the timing has to be perfect. Helen instinctively paused the recording. The silence afterward felt almost overwhelming. Nobody needed to ask whose voice they had heard. Victor looked at the tablet without saying anything. Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone. He simply looked at Victor with unmistakable disappointment. Would you like us to continue listening? Victor slowly exhaled before answering. Audio can be manipulated. Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. It can. Helen calmly resumed playback. The voices returned. Where do you want the original archive? The visitor asked. Victor answered. Inside the replacement briefcase. Nobody searches the attorney. The recording ended with the sound of an elevator bell followed by footsteps fading into silence. Helen lowered the tablet carefully onto the conference table. Even the air inside the room seemed heavier now. Amara quietly folded her hands together. She did not smile. She did not appear proud. Instead, she looked almost relieved, as though the responsibility she had carried since morning had finally become lighter. Nathaniel slowly picked up the bracelet and walked toward her. He placed it gently back into her hands. Your grandmother gave you more than a bracelet, he said softly. She gave you the courage to trust what is right. Amara looked down at the blue beads. She always said that truth deserves someone willing to remember it. Nathaniel smiled faintly. She was a very wise woman. He then turned toward the silent black briefcase resting only inches away. The recorded voices had answered nearly every question except one. The final proof still waited inside the polished leather case that had quietly dominated the entire afternoon. Nathaniel rested one steady hand on its handle once again. This time, there was no hesitation left in his eyes. The leather handle felt surprisingly ordinary beneath Nathaniel Whitmore's hand. After everything that had unfolded during the afternoon, the briefcase itself showed no sign of the storm it had quietly carried into the boardroom. Nathaniel slowly released the combination locks. Two soft clicks echoed across the silent room. Nobody breathed. Nobody looked away. As the lid lifted, neatly organized legal folders appeared on top, exactly the kind of documents every attorney carried. Victor Hale remained motionless. You see, he said calmly, there is nothing unusual. Nathaniel did not answer. Instead, he carefully removed the first folder, then the second. Beneath them rested a slim black portfolio that bore no company label. Helen Brooks frowned. That is not one of our legal files. Nathaniel opened the portfolio. Inside lay a portable storage drive, several printed laboratory reports marked confidential, and a sealed envelope carrying Grace Whitmore's name written across the front in neat handwriting. Helen's eyes widened immediately. Those are the missing originals. The head of corporate security stepped closer and quietly compared the document numbers against the secure archive list displayed on his tablet. After only a few moments, he looked up. Every serial number matches. These are the documents reported missing this morning. The room remained completely silent. Nathaniel slowly picked up the storage drive and handed it to Helen. Verify the contents. She connected it to her secured company laptop while everyone waited. Within seconds, the directory appeared. Every encrypted research file that had disappeared earlier that day was present, untouched, but deliberately hidden. Helen swallowed before speaking. The archive is complete. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. The disappointment he felt weighed far more heavily than anger. He had trusted Victor Hale for years, believing that integrity mattered as much to him as professional success. Now the evidence resting quietly on the conference table told a different story. Victor looked at the recovered documents before lowering his eyes. For several long moments, he said nothing. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice that carried none of its earlier confidence. I made one decision that I believed would protect my future. I convinced myself that I could control what happened afterward. Nathaniel answered quietly. The moment we believe truth can be controlled, we begin losing ourselves. Victor slowly nodded. There was no argument left. No carefully crafted explanation. Only silence. Nathaniel looked toward the head of corporate security. Please secure these materials, preserve every digital record, and continue the investigation according to company policy. Treat everyone with professionalism and respect. Yes, sir. The officer carefully collected the evidence without unnecessary drama. Nathaniel then turned toward Helen. Bring Grace here. Several minutes later, the conference room doors opened once more. Grace Whitmore stepped inside, looking confused after receiving an urgent message to return from another meeting. She stopped as soon as she saw the recovered documents on the table. Dad, Nathaniel walked toward her. You told me this morning that you never touched the missing archive. Grace nodded immediately. I told the truth. Nathaniel smiled gently. I know. He placed one reassuring hand on her shoulder. I should have said those words sooner. Grace's eyes filled with quiet relief. She looked toward Amara, who stood near the windows holding the blue bracelet in both hands. Was she the one who helped? Helen smiled warmly. She noticed what every one of us missed. Grace walked over and knelt so she could meet Amara at eye level. Thank you, she said sincerely. You protected my name even though you did not know me. Amara smiled shyly. Grandma always said that if someone is innocent, they deserve someone willing to speak up. Grace gently hugged the little girl before standing again. Nathaniel watched the moment with quiet gratitude. He realized that the most important decision made that afternoon had not been opening a briefcase. It had been choosing to listen to a voice that many people would have dismissed simply because it came from a child. Outside the windows, the evening sun settled behind the skyline, covering the city with warm golden light. Nathaniel walked back to the conference table and picked up the empty black briefcase. For a moment, he simply looked at it before quietly closing the lid. A polished appearance can hide many things, he said, but character always reveals itself eventually. He turned toward Amara once more. Your grandmother left you wonderful advice. Amara smiled softly as she fastened the blue bracelet around her wrist again. She said the truth does not need the loudest voice. It only needs someone brave enough to remember it. Nathaniel nodded. Today you reminded all of us that wisdom is never measured by age, wealth, or titles. The boardroom that had begun the afternoon preparing to celebrate another business victory ended the day learning a far greater lesson. Trust was not protected by power alone. Justice was not discovered through assumptions. Sometimes the future of an entire company could change because one observant little girl chose to speak when everyone else remained silent, and because one man powerful enough to ignore her instead chose to listen.